In this video, we'll go over cards which either destroy cards in your opponent's spell and trap card zone, or prevent them from using those cards in some way. And at number 10, we have YuGiOh, the lightsworn hunter. Now technically, this is a flip effect monster which destroys any one card on the field, but is one of the cards which helped popularize the very common Yu-Gi-Oh tactic of setting your trap cards during your main phase 2. Well, this card and one other card on this list, but I'll get to that in a second. Basically, Hunter was part of Lightsworn's, which is a deck that has seen play ever since its inception, and continues to see play even today because of how good milling cards from your deck is. And the Lightsworn Hunter used to be ran pretty regularly alongside them, as it used to be a legitimate first turn play to just set a monster in defense position, and then your opponent would attack into Hunter and lose one of their cards, while at the same time setting up the grave with a potential 3 Lightsworns. So if you went second, set your cards in your spell and trap card zone during your main phase 1, and then attacked into the Lightsworn Hunter, it could pop one of your back row cards. Whereas if you had just set them during your main phase 2, they would have been safe. And at number 9, we have Malevolent Catastrophe. This is the other card which popularized setting your traps during your main phase 2. This one much more so than YuGiOh, as this card has the effect where, when an opponent's monster declares an attack, you can activate this card to destroy all spell and traps on the field. So if you set your cards in your main phase 1, summoned a monster, and then attacked into your opponent, they would chain a Malevolent Catastrophe to destroy all of your cards that you just set. Whereas you could avoid this by simply waiting for your main phase 2 to set those cards, as there's no real reason to set them before your battle phase. And having all of your cards destroyed will teach you real quick to get out of the bad habit of setting your cards during your main phase 1. Unless you're a Duel Links player, where you have no choice. So if you've ever wondered why Yu-Gi-Oh players today set their cards during main phase 2, it's because of Malevolent Catastrophe and, to a lesser extent, YuGiOh. And at number 8, we have Jinzo. Jinzo just straight up stops all trap cards while it's on the field, with a blanket continuous effect that stops traps from being activated and negates the effects of all trap cards on the field. So back in the day when this card first came out, it used to be a meta-defining card, because for only one tribute, you had a 2400 attack beat stick, which also stopped trap cards, which was a much bigger deal back then when battle traps were much more common. This was also released around the time where Summon Skull was still kind of considered a decent card for having 2500 attack on one tribute. So Jinzo only having 100 less attack, and a really good fact on top of that, made Jinzo a boss monster of early Yu-Gi-Oh! It was still even a legitimate tech option in Monarch decks later on in the future. The reason it stopped seeing as much play is because monsters which require tributes kind of stopped seeing play, unless there was some way to cheat them out easily. Really, the only modern decks that still tribute summon monsters are Monarchs and True Dracos, I guess. And if Jinzo simply had 500 less defense, it would actually be really good in Monarch deck as an option to go into. But as it stands now, it's just a niche alternative that's a little bit too slow to play in Yu-Gi-Oh's current very fast meta. Especially since there are other cards that do what this card does, but easier. And there's even a trap card called Royal Decree, which basically has Jinzo's effect and doesn't require you to tribute summon a monster. Or there are just other cards which can destroy the problem cards without having to worry about a blanket negate like this. And at number 7, we have Naturia Exterio. This is a fusion monster card which requires 2 synchro monsters as its materials, and both of those synchro monsters are also really good back row destroyers, as Naturia Beast can shut down your opponent's spell effects, and Naturia Barkion can negate trap effects. So Naturia Exterio has a combination of these 2 effects, where if your opponent activates a spell or trap, you can banish one card from the graveyard and send the top card of your deck to the graveyard to negate any spell or trap and destroy it, which is a really good lockdown on 2/3 of the cards in the game. And the great thing about this card is that it can be cheated out of the extra deck, as it doesn't have the clause which says it can only be special summoned by fusion summon. So if you're playing Waking the Dragon, a card that allows you to special summon any monster from your extra deck if your opponent destroys it, Naturia Exterio is a completely viable option to play in your extra deck. So this card does see some niche meta play, just not in any decks that try to bring it out by its fusion summoning method. So even though this card easily shuts down spell and traps, the fact that it's difficult to bring out puts it at a lower spot on this list than some of the others I'm about to talk about. And at number 6, we have Mystical Space Typhoon. This is probably the most well-known card in the game, as if you call this card by its abbreviation, MST, people will know you're referring to this card, because it used to be one of the most played staple cards in everyone's deck, and in fact was played so much that it was put on the limited list, where people could only play one copy per deck for years. And all this card does is just destroy one spell or trap card on the field. But since it's a quick play spell card, you could use it at any point during your turn to destroy something, or use it during your opponent's turn to disrupt plays, or pop your opponent's trap cards before the end of their turn so they could never use them. And when MST came out, it was the only spell card that destroyed any spell or trap without any other kinds of restrictions. And that was a quick play spell card, which gave it so much versatility and usability. Basically, if you had MST in your hand, there was a good chance you were going to be able to use it to some beneficial effect. And there were a lot of cards in the game that were basically homages to MST that just had weaker effects in it, like requiring you to use the card as a chain link 3 or higher, or your opponent needing to have 3 or more cards in a spell and trap card zone. Eventually though, they loosened the requirements on cards which can destroy spell and traps, and they released so many other cards that can destroy spell and trap cards, but also do something else, that MST has kind of fallen out of favor, and has just been power crept to the point where it's kind of a mediocre card, in comparison to some other cards that I'm about to go over that are a little bit higher on the list. And at number 5, we have Heavy Dust Storm. This is a trap card that can destroy 2 of your opponent's spell and traps on the field, but at the cost of not being able to conduct your battle phase the turn this card is activated. So as long as you just use this card during your opponent's turn, you don't have to suffer the downside of this card. Now, it makes this card better than other trap cards that destroy spell and traps, like Dust Tornado, which doesn't have a negative effect, is that it destroys 2 of them. It's just straight up a 2-for-1, which allows you to go +1 in card economy. But it is heavily restricted by being a trap card, meaning it's not as versatile as an MST-like card that you can use during your turn to destroy floodgates, or use during your opponent's turn to disrupt plays. Heavy Dust Storm can basically only ever be used during your opponent's turn to disrupt plays, destroy your opponent's traps in their back row before they get a chance to use them in the end phase, and can only be used during your turn after it's been set for an entire turn, and at the cost of giving up your battle phase if you decide to use it during your turn. That is to say, it's still really good, as long as you use it during your opponent's turn to get rid of 2 of your opponent's spell and traps, which is worth the downside of it being a trap and forcing you to give up your battle phase if you have to emergency use it during your turn. And at number 4, we have Cosmic Cyclone. This card is like MST, except it banishes a spell or trap instead of destroying it. It also has a 1,000 life point cost. Now, this card does see play pretty regularly because there's lots of spells and traps that float nowadays, and have graveyard effects, and there's also lots of cards which protect their back row. Whereas Cosmic Cyclone gets around a lot of that, as it banishes the card without destroying it first, and also has all of the advantages of MST, of being a quick play spell card, so it can be used during your turn to destroy floodgates, or during your opponent's turn to disrupt plays, or pop back row before the end of their turn. And the 1,000 life point cost isn't that big of a deal, and in fact is considered a plus when used in Duel Links, because there's a lot of special skills in the game that activate after losing 1,000 life points, which Cosmic Cyclone can proc with its life point cost. And at number 3, we have Denko Sekka. While this card is on the field, and you control no set spell or trap cards, which means you can control face-up field spell cards, equip cards, or continuous spell and traps, just as long as none of them are set face down, its effect will activate where neither player can set spell or traps, nor can set spell or traps be activated. So it's a complete lockdown on spell and trap cards, and is absolutely a power crept version of Jinzo, as not only does it prevent them from using trap cards, it also targets spells, and doesn't require a tribute summon. But it does have restrictions, it cannot be special summoned, and you also can't set any spell or traps yourself. So as long as you use this in a deck that doesn't do any of that anyway, then you get nothing but upsides from this card, other than having to use your normal summon to bring it out, which is much easier than having to tribute summon a Jinzo. And because of that, Denko Sekka sees a lot of play in meta and anti-meta deck strategies. And at number 2, we have Trickstar Light Stage. This is a field spell card that allows you to search a card when activated, does extra bonus damage every time one of your Trickstar monsters does damage, and has an effect where once per turn, you can basically destroy one of your opponent's set spell and trap cards. Basically, it's not a full-on destruction, as there are some limitations to it. What it actually does is target one of your opponent's set spell or traps, and then your opponent has a chance to chain that card to this card, but if they don't do it, then they can't use that card for the rest of the turn. And at the end of the turn, they're forced to activate the card. And if they can't activate the card, or choose not to, it's sent to the graveyard. So on a field spell card, which already has a good search effect, it also just has a once per turn, basically destroy one of your opponent's spell or traps for no cost. And since it doesn't technically destroy the card, it also bypasses a lot of floating effects. Trickstar Light Stage, as Backrow removal, is almost completely broken in its level of usefulness, where as long as it stays around for a while, you can eventually get rid of all of your opponent's set Backrow, while not losing any kind of advantage. And that's why I think Light Stage is one of the best cards, which destroys Backrow, although the number 1 spot is undoubtedly the best, where even Trickstar players will play that card in their deck, or at least their side deck. And at number 1, we have Twin Twisters. This card has the effect to destroy 2 spell or traps on the field, at the cost of discarding 1 card. Twin Twisters is just a straight up power cut version of Mystical Space Typhoon, as it has all the advantages of MST, being a quick play spell card, while also having the advantages of destroying 2 cards, even if at the cost of 2 of your own cards. So if you're playing against a very back row heavy deck, it's very common for people to side in 3 copies of Twin Twisters, which is more than enough to break through pretty much any back row, or at the very least severely dampen it and allow Nightmare Phoenix to clear out the other problems. I should probably also mention Red Reboot. Generally, because Twin Twisters and Red Reboot exists, the average deck can side in 3 copies of both of these cards in order to push through basically any kind of back row that might stop them. As Twin Twisters has the ability to get rid of 2 of their cards and set up the graveyard, because in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, discarding 1 card isn't that big of a deal, and is actually seen as a plus in some decks. And Red Reboot can shut down trap cards for a turn, and can be used from your hand, which really offsets its very heavy downside, where you'll lose half your life points and your opponent gets another trap card in addition to the one not even being destroyed. And it's thanks to Twin Twisters, and to a lesser extent Red Reboot, that trap cards, or trap-heavy decks, have become very rare outside of a few exceptions, like Altergeist, although even Altergeist have problems against Twin Twisters and Red Reboot. Twin Twisters is just a really good example of Yu-Gi-Oh's power creep. It's just a straight-up better version of MST, which used to be one of the most played cards in the game, and now there's no real reason to play it when you can just play Twin Twisters instead. Alright, and that's the end of the video. If you think I missed any really good back row destroyers, or have ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, you might enjoy the backlog of the other top 10s on this channel, which will be linked at the end of this video. I think that playlist has about 50 videos in it now.